Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. And today we are looking at some really unexpected things. A $900 anonymous cash donation, a warehouse that processed like 50,000 pounds of old rags, and an infamous 19th century bordello.
Right, which sounds like the setup to a really strange joke.
It really does. But, what do these completely unrelated things actually have in common? Well, they are the building blocks of one of the most resilient social safety nets in American history. Welcome to today's deep dive. We're so glad you're here with us.
Yeah, it's quite the collection of elements. But, they illustrate a very specific reality about social work. Because when we think about a social safety net, we tend to picture this static hammock, right? Just strung up between two trees, waiting for people to fall into it.
Yeah, just catching whatever falls.
Exactly. But a modern safety net isn't a hammock at all. It's far more like, a frontline triage unit. It has to constantly swap out its tools, entirely redesigning itself, depending on whether the emergency coming through the doors is, say, an economic injury, an addiction, or a psychological crisis.
And that triage unit is exactly what we are exploring today. We are diving deep into John Appleyard's historical account, Waterfront Rescue Mission, 1949 to 1999. We're tracing the 50-year evolution of this wildly underfunded rescue mission in Pensacola, Florida.
And, to be clear to anyone listening, this isn't just local history.
No, not at all.
It is really a masterclass in how the definition of rescuing someone has to fundamentally change as the face of poverty transforms over time.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why Pensacola even needed a triage unit like this in 1949, we first have to understand the sheer brutality of the local fishing industry at that time. Like, what was actually happening down there?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the entire concept of the modern gospel mission movement was born out of massive economic displacement. Like, you go back to 1826 in Glasgow, Scotland, with a man named David Naismith.
Okay, we're going way back.
Right, because the Industrial Revolution hits, and suddenly thousands of displaced, impoverished farmers are just pouring into the cities to work in these new factories. And the cities had zero infrastructure for this.
Like no housing?
No housing, no sanitation. Traditional civic structures just couldn't process the sheer volume of human squalor. So Naismith had to create the city mission movement just to keep people alive, which, by the way, is a model that later inspired pioneers like William Booth to found the Salvation Army.
So it sounds like whether it's 1820s London or Glasgow or, 1940s Florida, rapid industrialization always creates human collateral. We build the new economic machine, but we completely forget to build the social support system for the people actually operating that machine.
That's a great way to put it.
But by 1949, Pensacola wasn't exactly a roaring industrial factory town, right? How did Pensacola specifically respond to this? What was displacing people there?
It was the deep-sea fishing industry. Pensacola's economy at the time leaned really heavily on red snapper and grouper fishing. And the men doing this labor were working on these vessels called Gloucester smacks.
Wait, a Gloucester smack? Are we talking about those massive old-school wooden sailing vessels?
That's right. Imagine a 100-foot wooden schooner out in the choppy waters of the Gulf of Mexico. These men were out at sea for 3 to 4 weeks at a stretch. And here is the brutal mechanical reality of their job. They weren't using giant automated trawling nets.
Because of the reefs.
Exactly. Snapper and grouper live deep down in the rocky reefs. If you drag a net over a reef, the rocks will just rip the net to shreds.
Meaning they had to catch these commercial fish individually, by hand.
Hour after hour, day after day. They used hand lines. So you're standing on the deck of a rolling ship, dropping a heavy line hundreds of feet down, and then physically hauling up 20-pound thrashing fish using nothing but your back, your shoulders, and, your raw, calloused hands.
Oh, man. I want you listening to this to just picture that physical toll for a second. It's grueling, back-breaking labor in complete isolation. You're completely disconnected from society for a month.
And many of these men were classified as casual labor. They were transient workers. They largely weren't married. They had no homes, no domestic roots whatsoever. So when that Gloucester smack finally docks in Pensacola after a month of brutal isolation, the captain hands them their pay. And in 1949, a month of this labor might earn you $75.
Which, even adjusted for inflation, is basically barely survival money. But I guess if you have no home to go to, no family waiting at the dock for you, the psychological release of finally being back on land is immediate.
And, destructive. Highly destructive. They took that $75 and walked straight into the waterfront saloons. They sought out the cheapest alcohol and the red light district. Without any anchor, they would blow a month's wages in a matter of days, sometimes just hours.
Wow.
And once the money was gone, they were simply discarded by the establishments. They'd be found passed out in the weeds along the bayfront, completely destitute, just waiting until they were desperate enough to get on the next boat. It was an unbreakable, vicious cycle.
So you have a city that has just normalized this cycle as the cost of doing business. The economic engine runs on these broken men. What actually breaks a systemic paralysis like that? Like, does the city government step in?
Not really, no. The city's infrastructure just had no real mechanism to handle it. The local police weren't villains in this story. They were just completely unequipped. Their only tool was to literally drag these unconscious men into the station and let them sleep it off on the floor so they wouldn't die of exposure out by the docks.
Right.
The actual spark for change didn't come from a municipal board. It came from two incredibly unlikely individuals.
And this brings us to Reverend Vernon Hosey. His background is fascinating. Before he ever got to Pensacola, back during the Great Depression, he was uneducated, broke, and feeling completely devoid of purpose. And one night, in the middle of a heavy snowstorm, he has this profound, almost biblical epiphany.
Yeah, he describes feeling a direct call from God to go to Central Avenue and preach. And Central Avenue was the notorious Skid Row of Atlanta.
And he didn't even want to do it at first, right?
No, Hosey literally argued with this calling. He said, "I have no money and I am entirely unqualified to speak to anyone." And the internal response he felt was, "Whom I call, I shall qualify." So he took his last 75 cents, bought a ticket to Atlanta, and just started walking among the destitute.
Fast forward a decade, and Hosey is a pastor in Pensacola. And this is where he meets the second part of that spark, Mary Cheshire. She was an illiterate but fiercely devout woman who ran a tiny, cramped place on the waterfront called the Lighthouse Cafe. Now, if you're running a cafe on a dock full of sailors coming off a month at sea, the obvious business move is to sell liquor. You'd make an absolute fortune. Why didn't she?
Because she understood the mechanism of their destruction better than anyone else down there. She saw that alcohol was the primary gear keeping these men trapped in that cycle, so she stubbornly refused to stock it. She served cheap food, tea, and coffee, and handed out religious tracts to men who, honestly, generally just mocked her for it.
But she holds her ground. And in July of 1949, she invites Reverend Hosey down to her cafe to see the reality of the waterfront firsthand. While they are sitting there, a local transient known around the docks as Alabama Joe walks in. He is clearly coming off a severe bender, he's totally depleted, and suddenly, he just breaks.
He collapses to his hands and knees right there in the middle of the cafe, weeping, pleading with Reverend Hosey to help him find salvation and stop the cycle. But this is where the brutal reality of the city's lack of a safety net hits them both in the face. Alabama Joe is begging for his life, he is still intoxicated, and there is nowhere to take him.
Nowhere at all.
No clinic, no mission, no hospital ward for a destitute alcoholic.
Imagine someone begging you to help save their soul, and your only option is to lock them in a dirty jail cell. That has to be the ultimate wake-up call, right? So what does Hosey do?
Well, Hosey's only option is to walk this weeping man down to the county police lockup. He has to actually ask the police to lock Alabama Joe in a filthy, vomit-stained bullpen with a dozen other screaming transient men, just so Joe can sober up behind bars without getting hurt.
I mean, I try to put yourself in Hosey's shoes for a second. You have dedicated your entire life to saving souls. Someone practically falls into your lap begging to be saved, and the only tool society has given you to help them is a jail cell. That has to be a shattering realization.
It completely broke him. Hosey went home, sat in his study, and realized that a city relying on police lockups as a medical and psychological intervention was failing on a fundamental level. He knew right then they needed a dedicated rescue mission.
But realizing a systemic need and actually finding the capital to fund a brick-and-mortar solution are two very different things. Hosey and his small prayer group literally had $0. So they approach a waterfront legend named Captain Benny Edmondson. And I'm sorry, I cannot skip over his official title. He was the elected custodian of lost timbers.
I know, it sounds like something out of a fantasy novel. But it was a crucial rough-and-tumble job. Timber rafts were constantly towed to the local mills, and logs would break loose in the bay. Edmondson's job was to take his tugboat and recapture these stray logs. He was a tough, shrewd businessman.
And Hosey walks up to this tough tugboat operator and asks for half of his waterfront warehouse, rent-free, for 6 months. Against all odds, Edmondson agrees. So they scramble. A local union paints the walls, people donate used beds. A woman brings in her own dining room table. They set up a two-eyed hot plate for a kitchen. Opening night is August 1st, 1949. They host a big fish fry. And how many people show up?
0.
Not a single person.
Not one. But on the second night, one man walks through the doors.
Yeah.
Alabama Joe. The very man from the police lockup. He becomes the mission's first convert, and he actually stays on to become their maintenance man.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And what's fascinating here is how the mission had to physically move, because when that free 6-month lease ran out, they had to find a permanent home. They locate this large brick building at 15 West Zaragoza Street. But this was not like an abandoned church or an old grocery store.
No, it definitely wasn't.
It was formerly Molly McCoy's Bordello. It had been one of the most famous high-end pleasure spots on the entire Gulf Coast. We're talking gold wallpaper, white marble mantles, cherry-colored satin curtains.
I just laugh at the irony of this. I mean, imagine the ultimate real estate flip, right? Turning a high-end 19th century brothel, a place literally built on exploiting transient men, into a sanctuary to heal those exact same men. It's the literal embodiment of redemption, isn't it?
It really is. Taking over a notorious brothel certainly raised some eyebrows in town. But you have to look at the practicalities. Hosey wasn't looking for symbolism. He was looking for cheap real estate with enough rooms to house dozens of men.
I guess desperate times bypass scandals. But they almost lost it immediately, didn't they?
They did. They negotiated a $1,000 down payment, they scrounged up $100, and the owner gave them 6 months to find the remaining $900. As the deadline loomed, their bank account was completely empty. They were days away from eviction.
And then?
Then, an anonymous Jewish benefactor from the city walks into Hosey's office. He wasn't part of their congregation, but he had heard about the men they were getting off the streets. He hands Hosey exactly $900 in cash. His only stipulation was that his identity must never, ever be revealed.
That is incredible, and that anonymous cash keeps the doors open. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because we move from the romanticized founding story to the brutal mechanics of running a charity. Securing a building is just day one. Running a mission, feeding, clothing, and housing dozens of men every single day requires a relentless, grinding supply of capital.
Absolutely.
And the 1950s were defined by staggering poverty for the staff. Listen to this. The director in the 50s was a man named Bill Woolley. The mission was so broke he couldn't even take a salary. His family, including 4 small children, had to live on the second floor of the mission, which was completely infested with wharf rats.
The sacrifice was just immense. To feed her kids, Woolley's wife, Madeline, relied on dented, unlabeled tin cans donated by local grocery stores. Because the labels were missing, dinner time was a literal guessing game.
Oh, man.
She'd open a can hoping for beef stew or vegetables. One night, she opens a can of mystery pink meat, and it turns out to be squid. That is how close to the bone this operation was running.
Squid. I mean, that financial desperation eventually forces immense creativity. Enter Ed Gray in 1963. Ed Gray is a brilliant operational mind. He is actually offered a management job at Walgreens in New Orleans with a starting salary of $30,000 a year. In 1963, that is serious wealth.
Oh, yeah.
Instead, he turns it down to take over the struggling, rat-infested mission for just $5,000 a year. And the very first thing he realizes is that you cannot run a modern triage unit on dented cans and hope. You need an economic engine.
Right, because before Gray arrived, the mission had a tiny dirt floor shed where they just gave away old donated clothes. Gray looks at that and weaponizes his corporate retail knowledge. He systematically transforms that shed into a sophisticated multi-store bargain center.
He's basically building a socially conscious proto-Walmart.
Exactly. He implements professional retail tactics, proper window displays, and a fleet of trucks to manage inventory pickups. He essentially built a corporate retail empire, not for shareholders, but to fund human recovery.
But the true genius wasn't what they sold. It was what they did with the garbage. Like, what happened to the clothes that were too torn or stained to be sold in the bargain center?
They created the rag business. This was a massive logistical undertaking. They created a circular economy. The residents of the mission, the men in recovery, were put to work cutting every single button, zipper, and metal clasp off of these unsellable clothes.
Because if you're using a rag to wipe down an industrial machine or a boat engine, a metal zipper will scratch the equipment.
Exactly the mechanics of it. They stripped the clothes down to raw cloth, build them up, and then Gray secured massive industrial contracts with shipyards and oil rigs as far away as New Orleans. These industries desperately needed cheap, clean wiping rags. At its peak, This tiny mission in Pensacola was processing and selling 50,000 pounds of rags every single month.
I cannot get over that. 50,000 pounds a month. They funded a homeless shelter by having recovering addicts cut buttons off old shirts to supply shipyards in Louisiana. It's a supply chain miracle.
And that reliable corporate funding changed everything. As they moved into the 1970s, because they weren't worried about the electric bill every week, Ed Gray and the board could actually evaluate the effectiveness of their methods. And they came to a very uncomfortable conclusion.
Which was?
The traditional soup kitchen model, giving a guy a cot and 3 hot meals, was fundamentally failing.
Right, because if you give a man a bed for 3 days, you treat the immediate symptom of exhaustion. But you do absolutely nothing for the deep lacerations of the soul and mind.
And the reasons people were coming in were changing rapidly. This goes back to our triage unit metaphor. In the 1950s and 60s, the typical guest was a 55-year-old alcoholic fisherman. The fishing industry had evolved, hand lines were replaced, and he was aged out and left behind.
But that demographic shifted drastically, right?
Very drastically. By the 1980s and 90s, the demographic plummeting through the cracks was totally different. The average age of the mission dropped to between 25 and 30 years old, and the core issue shifted from alcohol to severe, debilitating drug addictions.
Yeah, you can't just give a 25-year-old battling severe drug addiction a bowl of soup, pat him on the back, and say, "Good luck out there." Their entire neurobiology has been hijacked.
This raises an important question about how you actually rehabilitate someone. A 55-year-old former fisherman has had a career, right? He knows how to work. A 25-year-old addict might never have held a legal job in his life. He might lack basic literacy. To fix that, the mission completely changed its tools.
So what did they build?
They acquired 20 acres of rural land in Midway, which was donated by Methodists, and built the New Hope home. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a rigorous 90-day residential program pulling men out of the city to rehabilitate them, teach them trades, and break their addictions.
It's one thing to give a guy a warm meal and a bed for 3 days. It's a completely different level of emotional investment to spend 90 days rebuilding a 25-year-old's entire worldview and career. I mean, how did the staff sustain that kind of intense pressure?
They survived it because of an unseen army of volunteers. The staff couldn't do it alone. And as the 20th century closed, the crisis evolved yet again. The 1990s brought a tragic surge of dysfunctional families, abused women, and single mothers with children arriving at the doors.
So the triage unit has to change tools again. A dorm full of recovering 25-year-old male addicts is obviously not a safe or appropriate environment for a mother and her young children.
Precisely why they adapted by acquiring and beautifully remodeling historic Victorian homes on Cervantes Street.
Yeah.
They created a dedicated, dignified women's center. But again, the backbone of all of this expansion was the volunteers who made all this possible over 50 years. The perfect example is Dr. Clyde Miller.
Dr. Miller's story is incredible. In 1950, Dr. Miller is just a local physician who likes photography. He hears Reverend Hosey needs a projector to show a film to the men, so he brings his equipment down. After the movie, Hosey mentions they have men with serious, untreated medical issues. Dr. Miller just looks at him and says, "I can help with that."
And he didn't just write a check or volunteer for a weekend. For the next 50 years, Dr. Miller arrived at the mission at 6:30 in the morning, long before his regular hospital rounds. And importantly, he explicitly chose not to wear a doctor's white coat.
Because a white coat represents authority, hospitals, and bills, things these men were terrified of.
Exactly. It was a calculated mechanism for approachability. He wore casual clothes so he wouldn't intimidate the guests, and he provided free medical screenings, diagnostics, and care for half a century.
So what does this all mean? You hear about these massive systemic societal problems, drug epidemics, broken families, and it feels paralyzing. But then you look at Dr. Miller, who literally just showed up with a movie projector and ended up staying for half a century. It proves you don't need a grandmaster plan to start helping. You just bring whatever tools you have to the triage unit.
That is really the defining takeaway of the Waterfront Rescue Mission's 50-year history. It started as a single room in an old brothel, trying to keep transient fishermen from freezing in the weeds. Through relentless adaptation, it evolved into a multi-city network with corporate retail logistics, career development centers, and specialized women's shelters. They didn't survive because they had a perfect plan in 1949. They survived because they never stopped changing their methods to match the reality in front of them.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to mull over. The history of this mission proves that true charity, true compassion cannot be static. As our economy evolves, as technology shifts, the ways people fall through the cracks will always evolve too. Compassion isn't just about offering a safety net, it's about constantly redesigning that net to catch the specific people falling today. Look at your own city, your own neighborhood. Who are the invisible people falling through the cracks right now? And what outdated assumptions are preventing us from catching them? We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep exploring the history hidden in plain sight right in your own backyard.